Good morning and welcome to this BSI webinar on Brexit and Standards. It's the 4th of December 2017 at 10 a.m. My name is David Bell, I'm the Director of Standards Policy at BSI. Alongside me I have Scott Steedman, BSI's Director of Standards. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, David.
And Richard Collin, Head of European and National Policy at BSI.
Good morning, David.
So this is the second webinar that we've hosted on this topic. Today we'll be in 4 parts. First of all, we'll introduce BSI and we'll talk about our Brexit position. We'll talk about what BSI has been doing as the UK's national standards body to support this position. Thirdly, we'll speak about the issue of regulatory divergence, which I know is a topic that's come up many times, and what it means for BSI and for European standards post-Brexit. And finally, your views are very important, so we appreciate your questions. Some of them have come through already. If you haven't yet submitted a question, please do so through the email address, which you see on the screen, europeanpolicy@bsigroup.com. And we'd be pleased to try to answer as many of those questions as we can. So Scott, first of all, maybe you could just introduce BSI.
All right, thanks, David. BSI is the UK's national standards body and appointed by UK government to fulfil that role. Our role is to work with industry and other experts to curate the process of development and maintenance of British standards. We're independent and non-governmental. We've been doing this since 1901 and we're one of the most respected and active NSBs in the world. The standards that our 11,500 experts developed through our consensus-based standards-making process in 1,200 national committees contain knowledge used by the market, and they embody good practice. They're for voluntary use.
So what's BSI's objective in developing these standards?
Our objective is to enable businesses to improve their performance and to develop competitive advantage. Our policy, David, is to enable experts to influence the development of industry standards that are recognised internationally and that are adopted in the UK and many other countries as the way of defining good practice, whatever that is, a technical specification, a code of good business practice, or simply a guide that sets out best business performance and principles.
So how do our standards achieve this pro-competitive result?
Well, firstly, BSI is responsible for maintaining UK interests in international, European and national standards development. Year on year, it's worth saying that over 95% of the published British standards are adoptions of European and international standards. Secondly, what we aim for is to reach consensus on a single national standard adopted worldwide. This minimises barriers to trade whilst maximising the opportunities for UK business internationally. By getting the world to adopt our ideas wherever we can, and by promoting one single standard on any given issue, we simplify the market structure for trade and we accelerate innovation and growth. This model is the same at international level and European level. Both are seeking a single standard used everywhere. But the European standardisation system makes it a membership requirement to have the single national standard model. It's a more developed version of the international model. So both the international model of ISO and IEC and the European model are different, however, to the US multiple standard model, which we'll discuss later. All of our standards are developed by the market players, industry, consumers, etc., in response to market needs. BSI doesn't determine the content of our standards, that's done by our experts.
Thank you, Scott. So let's move to the topic at hand, the BSI's Brexit position, and hopefully we'll answer here questions that have been submitted in advance from Matthew of Chubb Fire and Security, Himanshu from LSTC, and Chris from Tideway. Scott, just tell us what's BSI's position on Brexit.
Thank you, David. BSI has a very clear policy on Brexit. Firstly, at international level, nothing will change post-Brexit. BSI will remain the national member for the UK of ISO and IEC. At European level, BSI will continue post-Brexit to meet the membership requirements of CEN, CENELEC and ETSI, the 3 European standardisation organisations. And in the UK, BSI is committed to having a coherent national catalogue of standards with no conflicting standards, national, European or international. So we'll continue to participate fully in the development and maintenance of European standards, we'll adopt them as national standards, and we'll withdraw any standards that would conflict with them.
So we know that the situation that the UK finds itself in with the rest of the EU vis-à-vis Brexit is unprecedented. Does this impact on the UK's membership of CEN and CENELEC?
No, let me stress again that BSI meets now and will continue to meet post-Brexit all the membership requirements of CENELEC and CEN. That means adoption of all CEN and CENELEC standards, withdrawal of conflicting national standards and notification of work and inclusion of stakeholders. We have a situation now where the new political reality of Brexit has not been taken into account in the relevant article of the current statutes of Sen and Senelec that refers to eligibility. We recognise that there's a vacuum in this article of the statutes, and so for this reason we're developing a plan to ensure continued full membership of Sen and Senelec post-Brexit. This position is based on the most likely outcome of the relationship between the UK and the EU and on current government policy, that is, no membership of the single market or customs union, and either some sort of trade deal following a transitional period or WTO only rules.
Thanks, Scott. Richard, good morning. Maybe you can just tell us a bit about the plan for Sen and Senelec membership.
Certainly. So the plan is to remove the vacuum in the eligibility article prior to the UK leaving the EU. So we're looking to avoid any loss of confidence, any uncertainty, any possibility for challenge for the participation of our experts. And so therefore we're working with Sen and Senelec, their presidents, we're working with the Brexit working group that's been created by the Presidential Committee, and we expect that group to start meeting early in the new year. In addition to that, we're developing a timeline, which is a timeline through the governance bodies of Sen and Senelec towards a change to the relevant article of the statutes in November 2018. We're seeking consensus with the other Sen and Senelec members about what needs to be done in relation to Brexit, and we're preparing materials that will help them to understand the issues and to work with us, including a position paper that will show BSI's Brexit view and will contain also supportive comments from a range of other national stakeholders. So this work necessarily has quite a long lead-in time. The European standards system is based on consensus of the members, and we need therefore to take our time in developing proposals that we and they can all accept.
So in the meantime, the 11,500 UK experts that Scott mentioned who are heavily participating in the European programmes, what does it mean for them?
Well, we need to be very clear on this also. What we're delivering here is continuity and stability. So UK experts should continue to take part in European standards development, continue to work within the European technical committees, being part of the UK delegations to those committees, being part of the European working groups. Chairs and conveners should continue to show their commitment, and there's no reason why UK experts should not put themselves forward should new chair or convener positions arise. And also very importantly, we should continue to host European meetings post-2019, post-Brexit in 2019. So I'm pleased to say that we already have one meeting booked in at BSI.
Excellent. Okay, well thank you, Richard, and thank you, Scott. So that's the background on BSI and BSI's Brexit position. The second part of the webinar concerns what BSI has been doing since the referendum to prepare for Brexit. Scott, obviously working with UK government has been really important, so tell us a little bit about what we've been doing.
Yes, that's right, David. We've been working right across government with ministers, with parliamentary committees, with officials, with stakeholders who also advise government. Our main engagement's been with BEIS, the Department for Business, where we have seconded a BSI staff member to work on Brexit and Standards issues. He works in the regulatory delivery team, who understand very well our concerns and give us great support across government. We've also seconded a BSI staff member part-time into the Department for Exiting the EU. We hold frequent meetings with them as well as with the Department of International Trade, for example on the possibilities of new free trade deals and how these could impact on standards.
And I've seen you given evidence twice at least at select committees. I know there's more to come on that one. So thank you, Scott. That updates us on what BSI has been doing with UK government over the past 18 months. Richard, what about other stakeholders?
Well, we've been working with a broad range of stakeholders, with small and large companies, trade associations, consumer other public interest groups, professional associations, testing bodies and so on, to make sure that the BSI Brexit position accurately reflects their views. And it does, so it very clearly does. We have overwhelming support for BSI's Brexit position and for the course of action that we're taking.
And of course, more webinars like this in the future, I'm sure. So finally, for this section of the webinar, what are, in all of those engagement activities that you're involved in, what are the regularly repeated misunderstandings in terms of Brexit?
Well, David, there's one particular issue that I really would like to talk about this morning. We've seen repeated calls that BSI should focus more on the international level as we move away from the EU. That would imply that BSI should shift its focus from European standards to international standards development. But this is a really fundamental misunderstanding. There is no binary choice between European and international standards. European and international standards are not in conflict with each other. The system is designed to avoid conflict, and it aims to achieve a single national standard for any specific aspect of a product or service. We only develop European standards where there is a specific market need that's not met in international standards. These European standards supplement the international standards in the national catalogue. So wherever possible, therefore, these are even the same standards. For example, over 80% of Senelec standards are identical to or based on IEC standards, and this figure is very similar for medical device standards from SEN and ISO. So it's not the case that our current focus is on European standards to the detriment of international standards. UK experts participate in 95% of ISO committees, the highest percentage of any country in the world, and over 50% of the BSI standards catalogue is already international. But we can perhaps put more emphasis post-Brexit on certain current initiatives. New trade deals we've already mentioned. More international trade will place greater emphasis on countries that are coalescing around one international standard. And further bilateral work with China is an obvious opportunity to have British standards adopted around the world. British standards which of course are, wherever possible, identical to international standards and do not conflict with European standards. And we also see further work with Commonwealth countries, for example through a Commonwealth standards grouping. So that's our point really, David. We don't have a binary choice between European and international. We have an opportunity to deliver national, European and international standards, to continue to spread the use of the single national standard model around the world to encourage trade and boost competitiveness, an opportunity to increase awareness in the UK market of standards as a tool for increased trade, innovation and growth.
But you're right, it is a comment that comes up from time to time, and in fact we've just had a question submitted in advance by Dave Matthews, who chairs several of BSI's committees. Will we work more with the US?
Well, we'd be very happy to. We already have excellent relations with ANSI, the US national standards body. We work with US standards developers. Working with them is something we do now, and we'll continue to do that post-Brexit.
And indeed other NSBs in Europe do the same, yeah. Let's move on now to the third part of the webinar and look specifically at regulatory divergence. That's a question that comes up a lot in our discussions. Scott, how do you see regulatory divergence impacting on BSI's membership of SEN and Senelec post-Brexit?
Well, this is a really important subject, and we have answered the first question already, I think. BSI's position is to continue to serve our stakeholders' needs by remaining a full member of SEN and Senelec. The second question implies that diverging legislation will prejudice that membership, and so we should perhaps examine that in some detail. Legislation in the UK will diverge over time post-Brexit between the UK and the EU, and some draw conclusions from that there's some inevitability about that negatively impacting our ability to remain a full member of SEN and Senelec. But I think it's not that simple, and I'm going to ask Richard to explain more.
Sure, Scott, thank you. Yes, more investigation is needed to be clear about what the likelihood is of divergence in different regulatory areas, and indeed the impact that might have on European standards in the UK, and leading on from that on BSI's membership of SEN and Senelec. So we need to develop an approach that takes into account developments over time, takes into account the specificities of the European single market and how that will play out in the UK post-Brexit. And this European single market, we know, is already a mixture of regulatory and harmonisation approaches. So we'll need different solutions that are based upon the precise nature of the issue that we see going forward. So there are seven different points that I can use to address regulatory divergence at the moment. So we start with the first one, that the link between standards and regulation is not actually that common. We have about 18% of European standards provide a presumption conformity with European harmonised regulation. The other 82% refer only to business practice. And the SEN Senelec system treats those standards that provide presumption conformity and those that relate to good business practice exactly the same. They run through all the same standards development processes. So we need, first of all, to keep this issue in perspective in terms of standards and the link to regulation. The next point is that UK legislation that relates to technical product harmonisation, we understand from government, will be exactly the same on day one post-Brexit as it is beforehand. And that's very significant. And this should also answer in part the question from Mike Melnick from Gilbarco Veederoot. So divergence will come relatively slowly, and it will come in a managed way. The same European standards will continue to support the same regulatory requirements in both the EU and the UK for an unspecified and quite possibly a considerable period of time. The third question is which legislation will diverge. We have these over 4,000 European harmonised standards supporting regulatory requirements. That's the 18%, the linking to the new approach, new legislative framework. For much of the legislation that these standards support, the legal requirements are expressed in high-level performance-based terms. So to give an example, the Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive, the EMC Directive, its essential requirements say that equipment shall not create excessive electromagnetic disturbance, and it shall have an appropriate level of immunity. So, again, it's a paraphrase, but where is the likelihood of divergence when these are your legal requirements? Unless the UK adopts a totally new regulatory model with legislation that includes the technical specifications for products, like the old approach that we had running up to the 1980s. So this, we believe, is very unlikely, and we expect to hear some government statements on this in due course. In other cases, the EU legislation, harmonisation legislation, is much more specific. And you can see this, for example, with the eco-design implementing regulations, which run across a whole group of different product ranges, televisions, set-top boxes, and outdoor heaters, light bulbs, and so on. Here, the role of standards is restricted to providing test methods. And this means, again, that we don't see such an issue with divergence, because even if the limit values are changing, the test methods will stay the same.
Let me just stop you there for a second, if I can, Richard, just to recap what I think I heard you say there. So
sure.
You're saying that regulatory divergence should well be manageable within the system, firstly because only 18% of the European standards provide that presumption of conformity. Second, we know that there'll be no change in day one and probably for the foreseeable future in those pieces of legislation which impacts on the standards catalogue.
Exactly.
Thirdly, the high-level nature of European new approach directives lends itself to anyway standards still being able to support different, slightly different requirements. And anyway, in those cases where it's more prescriptive, it tends to be test methods, which frankly it shouldn't impact anyway. Absolutely. I think you said you had 7 points. I think I've only captured 4 so far.
That's 4. That is 4 so far. Absolutely. So the fifth case is one where the single national standard, which implements the European standard, and as we said, that should also be the international standard. It can work for both UK and EU legislation. So we already have this situation in the UK now. We have differing building regulations for Scotland, England and Wales, but they are supported by the same group of standards, for a variety of different regulations. We can see this continuing post-Brexit as well. The next possibility is managing the way in which divergence works at national level. So post-Brexit, we're going to continue to engage with UK government to inform them when there is a possibility that the legislation they're looking at could prejudice our membership of Sen and Senlag, with a view to trying to make sure that it continues to work well. And in fact, this is something that we have done for many years anyway. When government comes up with new proposals, we work with them to be sure that it fits well with the standard system and that there are no unintended consequences elsewhere. Then the final possibility is very much the last resort possibility. And that's the possibility that already exists within the system to reflect differences in regulation in the standard itself. And this is by means of what's called an A deviation. We have A deviations in European standards when there is a national regulation that means that a certain part of the standard cannot apply in a certain state. But as I say, this is last resort, as is recognised right across the Sen and Senlag system.
But that's a good point about the building regulations in the UK. 3 different sets of regulations supported by 1 set of standards. And then your other point there was about working with government on the divergence issue to make sure they're aware of it so there's no unintended consequences. And your last point about A deviation actually picks up a question that's come in this morning, which says, does BSI see the use of A deviations as an option for maintaining membership? And what we've heard you say there is that's the 7th and very much the last resort. And we believe there are lots of other reasons why we don't need to.
But it is used today.
But it's used today
in many
countries.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. So regulatory divergence is a complex issue. It's too easy to say regulation will diverge, and therefore we have a problem. We need to be very clear about what the exact problem is in each case. There are several different ways of looking at it and dealing with it. And so we don't necessarily see this as a challenge to our future membership of Sandlike.
Thank you, Richard, for that. Let's move now to your questions. Thank you for those people who've submitted questions in advance and during the webinar this morning. Just to stress before we get into the questions that we're here today to talk about the standards related issues to do with Brexit. We know that BSI as a group provides some other services around CE marking. We can't talk about those here, but we can certainly put you on to people who can answer those questions. Dave Burtonshaw asks whether political intervention in the UK might bring difficulties for BSI in achieving its objectives. Scott.
Well, David, that's why we're working hard with UK government to ensure that they understand that standards are market tools developed in a process of international technical cooperation. They are market-led, industry, consumers, stakeholders, all participate in that process. We've seen no sign of political intervention at the moment, but we obviously need to remain vigilant.
Absolutely. Dave Burtonshaw also asked whether continuing to adopt European standards and we stress European standards rather than EU standards, which you sometimes see in the newspapers, will prevent the adoption of US standards and the US standards model to support a UK-US free trade agreement.
Well, a very interesting question, David. So we don't consider it's necessary to adopt US standards to support a UK-US free trade agreement. The US has free trade agreements with other parts of the world, and they generally don't adopt international standards as we do. So worth reiterating that the US standards model is a very different system to ours. It's known as a multi-path model. They describe it as unique, where conflicting standards can and do exist in the market. The use of standards with regulations in the US is different because the US operates a command and control system of prescriptive regulation, unlike the system that Richard described of performance-based regulation with standards being used in a voluntary way. So standards in the US with regulation are incorporated by reference into the regulation itself, and so in some sense are associated with the law in a quite different way. Our stakeholders are very clear in their preference for a single national standard that remains voluntary, which links through to the international standard, and that opens markets and promotes trade on equal terms, so is very, very much pro-competitive.
Yeah. Just a question that's come in around Annex ZAs and what will happen to BSEN standards with an Annex ZA that refers to an EU directive. Let me try and explain for those people who are not familiar with an Annex ZA. This is the part of the European standard which specifically draws the reader's attention to which bits of the standard refers to which bits of the European directive. Correct me if I'm wrong, Richard. What will happen to those on future BSENs?
A very interesting question, I think. Part of the issue here is all about that close relationship between standard and regulation and how that will work post-Brexit. And we know that UK government is looking at all of the systems of the way in which standards are cited currently in the EU official journal, what that will mean post-Brexit, and then the links to regulation should come into that as well, how that will work, what UK government expects to see in those standards, whether that would be an additional national annex explaining that that's the case, and what kind of designation procedure UK government will use to show that standards can provide presumption of conformity within the UK. So these are regulatory issues that government is talking about. We will work with them as closely as possible to make sure that it goes seamlessly.
But of course there are other countries in the European system, Switzerland being one, that have to cope with this already.
And they do indeed, yes. And they have different ways of doing that, depending upon the way in which their legislation links to the EU legislation. Right. So it's again, I talked about variety of harmonisation models. There's a variety of different regulatory models already within the standards system.
Using the same system.
Using the same standards to...
Same standards.
In fact, the questions come through on that. How are the legal differences handled currently in the case of Norway and Iceland, for example? Because we know that there are countries in the European standard system that are not in the EU, that don't adopt all of the EU directives. And I know you've done some work already with Switzerland, looking at their model. Anything else you can say about that, about Norway and Iceland?
Well, Norway and Iceland are countries members of the European Free Trade Association, and they are signed up to the European Economic Area Agreement. So that means that they adopt all legislation which is deemed to be relevant for the European Economic Area. They adopt it as national legislation, and they have that enforced through the EFTA Court, linking to the European Court of Justice. So that legislation should apply within Norway and Iceland in the same way, as long as it's within the scope of the EEA agreement. So for them, the situation isn't much different. It tends to be more different with Switzerland, that has, while being an EFTA member, is not a member of the EEA agreement, and so they work instead on a series of bilateral treaties with the EU, bringing in the EU legislation, or at least reflecting that in Swiss national legislation in a way that is satisfactory to both parties. But their system is rather different.
But bearing in mind that this is about the industry standards, market-led, used as voluntary tools, it's a more flexible system that allows all of these countries to use the single standard used everywhere.
Exactly.
International and European model.
Including Turkey and Serbia.
Serbia and Macedonia. Yeah.
One question that's come in, I know this reflects some concerns from the experts who sit on the committees. What's going to happen to the English language? Certainly only one country will have English as a first language within the European system, within the EU, we should say. Do you see any change with regard to English language as the base language for so many European standards? Will French and German take over? What's the position on that?
I can't see that changing.
The official languages of ISO are English, French and Russian. It seems to me fairly straightforward that English will remain the established language for international standards making. There's no reason we will continue as a full member of CEN and CENELEC. That's our plan. There are many countries within the European system that are very obviously comfortable to work with in English. And at the international level, English is very much the chosen language.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Richard. So next steps, I know, Scott, you're likely to be in front of a select committee again shortly. The engagement work goes on with industry and with government?
Certainly does.
Yes.
We've got lots more to talk about. We've got more evidence to give. We're very concerned to ensure that misunderstandings don't propagate, and we see quite a lot of that in the media, unfortunately. So it's very much our job to try and make sure that everybody in the UK and indeed internationally are using the same and correct language when they're talking about standards. And we're not talking about regulations, we're talking about voluntary industry standards, market-led tools for accelerating innovation, competitive advantage for UK. So we want people to use the correct language. If they're talking about the law, let's ask them to talk about the law. If they're talking about standards, we'll talk about standards. But these are important misunderstandings that have been flying around, and we need to be sure that over the next coming months we address them.
And Richard, engagement more with stakeholders through December. I know you've got a couple of events coming up with consumer organisations. What are they telling you?
Our consumer network and other consumer organisations all have very much the same view, very clear in the importance of remaining full members of CEN and CENELEC as we've said so far. So it's clear for consumers that they see the involvement in European standards as something that very much comes from UK consumers. The UK consumers are really strong in Europe, and standards have a significant effect upon the safety of products, and so that needs to continue.
So just let me just wind that up again. So the national catalogue, for which BSI is responsible of industry standards, comprises international standards, and where there isn't a suitable international standard, European standards, and where there isn't an international or European standard, national standards. And that group of national standards as a proportion of the total is declining year on year as we adopt more international and European standards to meet the needs of the UK economy. But we've had very, very strong messages from all our industry groups, both individual companies but also industry associations, that this is the model they want to continue with, the single standard used everywhere, as happens in China and you see in other countries, Canada, others moving to that system.
Thank you, Scott. So let's just draw this to a close. We're running out of time, but we've heard from BSI on their position on Brexit and what we're doing to achieve that. We've looked at the specifics of divergence of regulation and what that could mean. Scott, would you care to make some final comments on this?
Well, thank you, David. Just to say that our message is one of continuity and stability. Post-Brexit, BSI will continue to serve the needs of our stakeholders by enabling them to participate in the development of international, European and national standards that they need to help improve their performance as a business March 2019 is getting close. Our job is to maintain our course through what will undoubtedly be some quite rough water, but I hope we will come through that smoothly into the calmer waters beyond that. We'll continue to put the development of international standards first. That is our priority, as it is of our European colleagues across the CEN and CENELEC system. International standards are the passport to trade. It's entirely compatible with our commitment to the European standards system. ISO and IEC, as well as CEN and CENELEC, espouse a single national standard model, and BSI and our UK stakeholders are committed to this.
Scott, Richard, thank you very much, and thank you for tuning into this webinar. Apologies that we haven't been able to answer all of your questions live. We will try and put a summary up onto the website with some of those answers on. A version of this will be available shortly on BSI's YouTube channel. And of course you can submit further questions, europeanpolicy@bsigroup.com for those. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.